Good morning. John Newton, in his discussion of the law and the right use of the law of God, speaks specifically of the law that was given to Moses, the commandments given by God to Moses to write down for the people of Israel after God brought the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. And Moses was given a ceremonial and a Levitical law, a law of religious practice specific to that time. And Newton will deal with that separately. But he speaks first of the Decalogue, what he refers to as the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, uttered by God himself as an abstract, a summary of the moral law, revealing God's character and God's intention for how humanity is to live. And Newton says that among its purposes is for it to reach to the most hidden thoughts of the heart, the law to penetrate into our heart and to see not just our actions, but our motivations of obedience and disobedience. It is to require absolute and perpetual obedience. In other words, there's no just partial obedience to the law, and there's no just temporary obedience to the law. It is absolute and it is perpetual. And, he says, its purpose is to denounce a curse upon all who continue not therein. In other words, there's a consequence for not obeying God's law. A consequence that would lead us to despair, because none of us, when we consider the thoughts of our hearts or our actions, when we consider the absolute and perpetual obedience required, none of us are able to keep that standard. Now, that would lead us to despair, and it should rightly lead us to cry for mercy, but we can do it as Christians in hope, because we realize that the requirements of the law, though we strive to meet them, have been kept once for all and finally by Jesus Christ on our behalf. Now, Psalm 116 doesn't speak explicitly of what God would ultimately do through Jesus to fulfill the requirements of the law, but it is a psalm of thanksgiving that speaks to the recognition of what God has done to save us in the midst of our misery. And in relation to that, following what God has done, it speaks of what our response to him ought to be. This is what Psalm 116 says, just in summary. I'm not going to read it all. It starts by saying, I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy. God hears our pleas for mercy, and in response, we love him. We respond in obedience out of love for what God has done for us. God's actions are enumerated as you go through the psalm. Verse 6, it says, the Lord preserves us. The Lord delivers us, it says in verse 8. And then the psalmist asks the question, what shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits to me? That's verse 12. In other words, of all these benefits that God has given to me, what shall I render to the Lord? Now, there's no way that we can pay back the Lord for what he's done for us, for his keeping of the law on our behalf and paying the penalty of the law's curse on our behalf. There's nothing that we can do to pay him back for that. But what shall we render to him for all the benefits that he's shown to me? Well, verse 13, the psalmist replies and says, I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I'll follow him, and I'll lift up the cup of salvation. I'll proclaim what God has done. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Public worship, public praise, public declaration of God's goodness. Then he goes on in verse 16 to say, I am your servant, the son of your maidservant. You have loosed my bonds. You have freed me, and so now I belong to you. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving, verse 17 says. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst, O Jerusalem. We long for the day when we can again gather in the presence of God's people, physically, in the courts of his house, to render him praise for what he has done.